All right, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap. I'm really excited about this one. This is a great topic. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded. So if you miss any or all of it, you will have the opportunity to access the webinar again on demand. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your question and answer tab on your interface there and submit your question, and we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. We also have an interactive chat feature on this interface, and so hopefully we can get everybody engaged in some conversation as well. And at the end of today's webinar, we are going to be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is tackling open source governance in the enterprise. Our speakers today are Eric Tice, who is the Director of Global Open Source SME Lead at Wipro Limited, and Jeffrey Martin, who is Associate VP of Product Management at WhiteSource. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me today. Great to see you both.
Always great to see you, Charlene.
Great. All right. Well, Eric, you're going to be kicking us off. So I'm going to put myself on mute, take myself off camera, and let you go right into your conversation.
All right. Thank you, Charlene. Welcome, everyone. I think this is a topic of great importance when it comes to open source. So in this context, we're going to talk a little bit about open source in general and how governance is a key component of leveraging open source within your enterprise. As we all worked through last year and slightly the year before that, COVID basically changed everything for all of us. And we hear that a lot. Almost every webinar starts to cover this topic. The reality is the ways of thinking and working had already started to change with the advent of open source over the years. New ways of working, new ways of considering how you can potentially leverage innovative new tools to tackle things. But COVID really made us start to think, as many organizations may not have been completely prepped to handle, complete working from home scenarios, large components where you had very siloed development teams and operations teams that were used to being in the same office and being able to continue to migrate and work together very easily became a very complex thing for people to work with. And thinking about how do we manage that risk moving forward? How in the enterprise can we really start to understand, where our gaps are? What is the cost really of open source versus proprietary tooling? As a lot of organizations took a very serious hit with COVID, as a lot of budgets needed to be slashed to manage the new ways of working, the new infrastructure that needed to be brought up to effectively and efficiently work in new ways, as well as really thinking about how do I get to market in an industry and in where everything is completely migrated away from an on-prem type of activity where my people can no longer come in and easily deploy, sometimes still using manual processes over automated processes. And then security, of course, as you migrate into new ways of working and your enterprise shifts completely from a more focused on-prem, very secure environment to everything needing to be done remotely. The key component here as we start to think through all this is the monitoring capabilities for a lot of organizations also took a major hit, where they may have been monitoring very specific infrastructure capabilities and now having to shift away from those proprietary tools or the on-prem infrastructure to cloud-based or hybrid cloud scenarios really started to make companies reevaluate, how am I going to govern and manage my tooling, not just open source, but proprietary, and started to have the conversation around, well, am I using the right tools? Is my staff able to adequately step forward and meet the new challenges that COVID and governance risk management has really become a problem for us? So how do we address that? Go ahead, Jeff.
It's actually kind of funny. The COVID really just basically forced about 3 years of transformation into one. These were all things that were really going to happen anyways and had already started, but we had to handle it all at once. Especially some of the pieces around, changing from on-premise infrastructures to things like infrastructure as a service. I've lost track of the number of people who've said, they've fully embraced DevOps now or DevSecOps, or even just like you said, monitoring changes. Lots of people asking questions about how they change their monitoring to be able to go to a SaaS first world.
And that acceleration, certainly from a roadmap item that might be 2 years down the road to now immediately having to deal with it, is certainly caused a lot of organizations to restructure and manage how they do things. So thinking about the evolution of open source, this slide is fairly interesting, where previously, when everything started in technology, everything was built into a box. It was very project-based. It was necessary for teams to focus very clearly. And older languages, legacy languages, COBOL, RPG, even early Java and other languages, until I think most people will recognize the person in this picture is Linus, who brought us Linux, and then later Git, and arguably is one of the forefathers of open source. Started to really preach and evangelize new ways of working, thinking about how to do things beyond the very old ways of hey, don't touch that, we'll all focus on this very clearly. And then moving to the circles where it may still be siloed, but thinking through agile ways of working and DevOps principles as they started to be introduced in the industry, really kicked off open source to a place where new ways of working, new technologies needed to be built. And certainly this isn't about DevOps, but if you think really about the DevOps capabilities and beyond just the tooling, but the culture as well, about 90 to 95% of all of the tools that are out there are based or written in open source. So as that continues to grow in the industry, and we look really toward a shift of more of an open source and innovative mindset, the last picture in the corner kind of speaks to open source really begins the community aspect of how we can leverage new innovative ways of working and not rely specifically internally only on the developers on our team, but how we can build out tools that benefit the industry as a whole and think through the new ways of working that we gather from people all over the world. Many open source projects are not geo-specific. They typically have contributors everywhere. So as that continues to grow and those capabilities, often, and we'll talk a little bit about security and other components that in an open source world, but that really has become the conversation point and we'll talk about some of those metrics.
Look, fundamentally, everything's been evolving this way for 15 years? It's basically how long this journey's taken so far. But we're getting to the point where this is the default way of working. It's not uncommon anymore. Everybody still faces adoption challenges with agile principles because applying the principles to your specific situation is still painful. But this is a journey we've all been on, and I think we're all pretty close towards the right-hand side of this. I really don't think there's too many people on the left-hand side completely.
And I think the reality, per the last slide, COVID really forced a move toward or thinking about how to get to the right side faster. And certainly thinking Git came out in 2005. So
right,
how long ago that was.
That's basically where I pulled the 15 years from, by the way. I'm like, Git was the real push, but yes.
But, as we think about the ecosystem of how more and more organizations are leveraging open source, there are over 56 million developers and rising worldwide who are contributing to open source. And this is strictly from GitHub. This doesn't even include private repos or other potential places where you can retrieve this. And if you think through 2.9 million organizations are actively leveraging or contributing toward open source communities, the number of contributions continues to grow in the billions every year. As we really, really think about this, 60 million plus repositories of variants, and we're not just talking about forks and branches off of existing, but new projects and components that continue to be available And some of those will fail off to the wayside, but many will continue to grow as, and become more prevalent in the industry. So, and certainly, as you can see, the contribution rate, 20 million plus closed issues just in the last year. So it's a vibrant community that continues to grow, and as such needs to be given new ways to manage and govern those types of tooling to fit and integrate well into your ecosystem.
I mean, look, fundamentally, it keeps accelerating. This isn't by any stretch the top. Open source is becoming more and more a default way of working, and more companies are doing things like investing their own resources into maintaining and updating open source as well. So many big companies are now pushing that as part of their commitment back to the community. That these numbers will all grow significantly as you look forward.
Yeah, and as we talk about that, 95% of organizations in some way are leveraging open source. Even many proprietary tools under the covers use or leverage open source to help derive their offering. And certainly, 90% of that uses open source. 70% of application code is open source and continuing to rise. And one of the key metrics that was really important to me is that we talk about all of these organizations that leverage open source, and as Jeff said in the last slide, it continues to grow year on year. Really, that metric is that 94+% of IT managers are really saying that open source is better than proprietary software. And as we talk about how we govern this and manage it, the reality of this is the speed to market. The community base is often much quicker to provide updates in open source technology. And given that, the security risks of open source and some of the risk management components that we'll discuss in subsequent slides really is something that is a key benefit of open source, as well as a potential hindrance that requires a governing strategy.
Yes, and we'll go into it, of course, but that governing strategy needs the correct tooling to actually be able to execute at any sort of scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, one of the foods for thought in open source, the real reality is when most people hear open source, what they immediately go to is, well, it's free, right? Well, everything has a cost. There's no free lunch, as the saying goes. Open source, while from a license perspective, may be free, you have to understand really what the actual cost of open source can be. You're leveraging components that essentially are being built by a community, which is a huge benefit in some cases, but do have costs from a support model perspective. Picking the right tools and understanding the complexity of the licensing that's been provided for those open source tools is really a key component of leveraging open source. Because while a license for a proprietary tool is very straightforward in most cases, there are hundreds of open source license variants that exist out there. While many of them are very permissive, there are certainly some that you need to look at the variants to understand how and when you can use those technologies. And really, the vulnerabilities and capabilities of open source are a key component. As you use or leverage, and this is true in proprietary software as well, as you leverage a tool that uses open source or is purely open source itself, understanding what the security risks of how that's been uploaded into the repository, is it being managed properly? And does it have dependencies that have risks in and of itself? So these are some of the cost capable things that you need to understand when leveraging open source, and that leads to, a key need here. Enterprise libraries of open source capabilities within an organization, many companies don't fully have a library even of the proprietary tools, as they may not have an enterprise strategy completely. They may have many facets or development teams that they allow to leverage the tools that they want, which is perfectly fine in most organizations. But if you don't understand what you're paying for and what the potential security risks of each of those across your enterprise are, that can be very costly.
Yeah, and fundamentally, and I'll take this opportunity to hit one of the Q&A questions. Guys, feel free to throw those in there. Yeah, we actually read them as we're going, and we'll address them at the end as well. So there'll be plenty of time to address questions. Pop them in. But so fundamentally, I think it was a good question, which is, how does a security tool fit in here? Well, the number one thing, as Eric just said, is knowing what you have. And tools like ours at WhiteSource let you first determine your actual inventory. And if you don't know what you have, you cannot govern it. And that is the number one problem still in open source usage, which is, what am I using? What are the transitive dependencies? What am I actually adding into my code that adds to my risk? And that goes directly into the costs as well. Because yes, your cost for maybe implementing the open source is zero, but your cost for mitigating it, managing it, and governing it is definitely not zero.
Absolutely. Yeah, and starting to bring through that, the conversation around governance and a key component of really working with open source is really defining a framework around how you can adequately manage the open source in your company. So, key to any framework or plan within your organization is certainly to have an organizational strategy, moving beyond just the project-to-project strategy and really understanding what the key components of your organization need to be from a technology perspective, marrying the business. And this goes a little more into a DevOps cultural conversation, but it's true in governance as a component of that. That really understanding the business and how the technical supports it roadmap is a key component. Understanding, to Jeff's point, what open source you currently have, what's your strategy moving forward to manage that open source, and policies and standards. While a lot of organizations have internal standards, one of the things open source really brings forward is a whole new way of managing best practices, collaboration and communication capabilities. And certainly as part of that, the key component of whether or not you'll become an open source first organization or you'll really start to just be a user and collaborator of open source is something that you'll need to define. And those policies and standards are really something that have developed in the open source community. We talked very briefly about risk management, but the reality is a core component of governing anything, open source or proprietary tooling within your enterprise, is going to be, managing what are my risks, really understanding what those currently are. Am I compliant? And when you leverage open source, as Jeff mentioned, and we said in previous slides, the licensing capability of those is a key component. Understanding your dependencies, what's being worked, what are the potential security risks of using these tools, and defining those very clearly so that you can manage that. And of course, one of the key components in any of this, and WhiteSource is one tool that helps to provide this, as per the question that was asked earlier, is really providing that observability into what you're using. What is the license, currently managed? When does it expire? What does it cover? All of those capabilities. And then, of course, third-party management. You'll manage any homegrown tooling or capabilities within your enterprise, but you're always going to integrate that with outside tooling. And this is true, again, of any tool that you purchase or download from open source. You have to understand what it's using under the covers so that you can understand, is it compatible with your software internally? If I adopt this technology, is it using libraries that will overlap libraries I already have in my enterprise, causing my application to no longer function correctly? So, and then what's the support model? Is it purely community? Are there commercial options out there?
And this is where the rubber really hits the road, right? Building an actual governance framework around open source. And I'll focus on the bottom half of this, but it's important to, highlight that little circle in the middle that says they're all interconnected, because they really are. But, a couple of the things that people tend to start with is, like I said, of course, knowing what you have, but setting the policies around it. How out of date do we let open source go? Are we comfortable with 2 major versions back? Probably not. There needs to be some sort of governance around, how up to date you keep it. And of course, you want to automate as much as you can around that, but it starts with the policies and the observability, followed by the remediation, right? So being able to understand what licenses you're okay with or not, and then enforcing it. Things like out-of-date policies, things like CVE policies, how, if we have a critical CVE, must we replace this, or is it, different in different areas of the product? Literally being able to write all this down is a very, very important first step that can happen concurrently or right before you actually do a full inventory. And of course, all that does tie into other things like your change management policies and things like that. But, fundamentally, just to narrow it down to open source for a second, being able to write those policies and procedures and what's okay versus not is sort of the very first step. And in my experience, it's the one that a lot of people don't realize it's there until they start looking for it.
Yeah, and one of the things, in adopting a framework is understanding that the mentality when you're innovating and using new technologies is certainly not an all or nothing proposition. Many organizations tend to jump on things like microservices or agile or, cloud, and it's an all-in scenario. With open source, the reality is that you have to really find the gaps and map the best tooling to your enterprise based on your needs. In certain areas, there may be tooling which is not fully developed in an open source world that may not be a good fit for your organization. And there may be others which are a perfect fit. But really understanding that and understanding that compliance model. One of the questions that came across, which is really relevant in this space is, managing that inventory. How do you keep that up to date? And what's an efficient way to do this? And, this is, a reality. Jeff mentioned, what White Source is capable of, fully automating your capabilities and doing frequent scans of your code base is a key component of doing this. As part of the framework that you build out, you have to build a model for maintenance and management to continuously look at, hey, what are we using? What is the planned component base of this? How are we integrating that with our tools? So if I update a proprietary tool that may be integrating specifically with something open source, I'll need to know all of that inventory. And as you hopefully have DevOps automation pipelines that will allow you to run tools like White Source periodically, you'll be able to keep up with that inventory and understand where those issues can potentially arise.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention too that sort of fundamentally, there's a lot of best practices that go along with a lot of these. Old school, go back 10 years ago, it wasn't too uncommon to have developers do things like copy and paste code out of open source, right? The infamous code snippets. There is no reason in the world that should be allowed. Always include the full library so that the licenses carry over and things like that are good default governance policies that need to be developed and then communicated clearly for any sort of enterprise scaling.
Okay. And thinking really kind of about that repository management and thinking about how you manage the code as an additional conversation about inventory that came up, and third-party licenses, really starting to think about how your components fit together. What is your repository going to look like of these tools? Understanding the licenses in the reality of community versus commercial versus proprietary type of tooling and how they need to integrate together is really key. One of the key components I mentioned earlier is really release cycles. As you continue to release new software from your organization, you'll need to do those scans. And ideally, as you set up things as they go to your dev, your QA, and other environments through an automated system, you'll be checking those and running the compliance and versioning capabilities for compatibility. My background is a lot of Java, right? For years, I've been a Java developer and an architect and other things. So I can tell you that, anyone who's used Java knows that if you use the wrong jar files and it becomes a real mess trying to get your application moving forward. And if you integrate with a third-party tool that leverages something that's 2 versions older or 2 versions newer than what your code is capable of using, that's problematic. So the governance capabilities and really thinking through, pardon me, that management component of governance, as we talked about in the last slide, is key. That tooling to actually track and manage your governance platform will help. And certainly security vulnerabilities, in the open source world, the licensing is one portion of that, but really understanding the reality of who's working on the tooling. How big is the community? What are the processes for actually submitting new code into an open source community, and how that is being governed in and of itself is a key component that you'll have to fundamentally make sure is part of your governance plan, because you can't or don't want to go grab a community-based open source project with 2 developers that hasn't had a check-in for 2 years versus something that's actively worked on continuously, that has a broad community of people that can help to support and provide patches as needed.
Yeah, one other little tactical thing there is also trying to reduce the number. It is very, very common, as I look at people's inventories, to see multiple different open source libraries or components being implemented to solve the same problem. Generally speaking, you want to try to solidify that, because then you're decreasing your risk surface, right? There's no need to solve a problem with 2 different libraries for the same problem, because all you're doing is introducing 2 things to manage the risk for the exact same gain. So policies around deduping, or one thing per functional need, can be very, very helpful, and that becomes problematic at enterprise scale because you get different teams working on different items. But a good way to handle that is things like artifact repositories or whitelisted components for open source.
Right. And you want to find that happy cultural medium where it's not the ivory tower, but it is something that governs innovation and manages the ability to try and actively use new things. But if it's one of those scenarios where, if you have 4 or 5 tools doing the same thing, maintenance becomes problematic, and your licensing management begins to become more and more problematic. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So, open source and security. I'll let Jeff go ahead and talk through this slide.
Sure. So, and by the way, Kenneth, I'm going to work in your question here. So, look, fundamentally, open source tends to be the major application security vector for things that are actually exploited, because all of the problems are public. It's very easy for a bad actor to go target because they're public vulnerabilities, and also because the use of it is so widespread that it provides a very good return on their investment for an exploit. This really has kind of shown up recently, especially with older pieces of open source software. The older it is, the more problematic and more likely you're going to have for more CVEs, more security problems. It is an inherently horrible idea to keep old open source around. You're almost asking for problems. The reason I said I was going to work Kenneth in here is I'll talk about remediation a little bit, Kenneth, but one thing that's important when we're talking about these governance frameworks is if you don't currently have one, it looks different when you go to implement it the first time than it does on an ongoing basis. And this is one of the main reasons. The amount of vulnerabilities in code that hasn't been maintained cleanly and hasn't had the governance before becomes too problematic to actually address. I've seen reports come back with 10,000 CVEs of high or critical in the code base because nobody's been maintaining it. You need a slightly different governance strategy to address that and get it to a manageable level than you need to keep it at that level. So there really are 2 different tacks you need to take if that's your situation. Just because the amount of problems can be pretty bad. And the place I would normally expect to start is, okay, let's update things as much as we can. Somebody asked, how old do you consider old code to be? I don't know if there's one answer, Eric. Do you have a good answer for that?
Yeah.
It depends so much.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is old is is really relevant in different ways in different industries. So, I mean, something that's, potentially, running off of a mainframe-based technology, often is looked at as legacy or old code, where, in some instances, the processes that are running may be much faster on a mainframe. Old code is really something that hasn't improved or hasn't been upgraded in a long time. So even with COBOL, for example, there are new versions of COBOL if you're still running off of something that's 20 years old. If you're still using, Spring 1.0, for example, within a Java framework, it's really looking at, are you doing the appropriate security patches? Are you, constantly upgrading your software to be, less vulnerable and provide more capabilities within the industry? And this is true of any technology, but in open source, because of the speed of innovation and how often this is happening, you have to pick the right times and really govern the capability of those to assure that you're getting the best patches. And one of the things that Jeff mentioned is you want to avoid not only the number of people that are and the number of tools that you bring in that do the same thing, but as you're working with a community, you need to understand clearly, as I mentioned before, how is that being managed from an update perspective? Are there owners of the project who are, managing pull requests and checking and managing the things that get pulled into the main releases are fixing vulnerabilities, not causing them?
Yeah, there's two big characteristics of what I call old. One is unmaintained. So just nothing's happened in that code base for 3-4 years. That's not a good place to be. And then the other one is you're on older versions, right? You're 2 major versions back. That's definitely what I refer to as old, but it might not actually be all that old in time. It just is a function of the open source project and how much they update. But in general, unmaintained is the one that scares me the most because it has too many unknown unknowns. At least with, a couple versions out of date, what the problems are and you can mitigate them.
Correct. Yep. And all right. And one of the other questions that was kind of asked that's really a key component here is, teams try and struggle really with how you would whitelist these tools that you would provide. How do you really provide, and, I'll merge this with another question, how do you really look to provide the overall scale of benefits of open source and how you manage the success? Well, architecture teams and CTOs, again, if you build the appropriate framework up front, you really start to document the reality of your best practices, your mitigated risk management policies and other components, you start to really evaluate what open source technologies make the most sense for your organization based on both your business strategy and your technical strategy moving forward. Are you looking to innovate or do you need to build off of something proprietary, either built internally or externally? As you whitelist those and really start to look at a reliable way to do this, it really requires an in-depth knowledge of the licensing capabilities, what those licenses are, and how those communities are managed. And Jeff hit on this very clearly. The reality is if you're trying to whitelist things, you can very easily, get away from what, he described as old technology, things that haven't been updated for, several years, or in some cases a year is the time to live for this project over. Does it have the appropriate number of community members to make it a viable product in your mind? And certainly those are the things that a good governance strategy will address. But, it is a much broader question, and certainly that's something that, offline at some point we'd be happy to talk.
Yeah, I'll throw one sentence on there because I think there's 2 different approaches to whitelisting or allow listing, which is rule-based, which is my preference. Have tooling that allows you to do rules, right? State has to be the most recent major version. Has to have had a release in the last year. Little rule engines to actually execute that and whitelist things. Licensing is the easiest example there. These licenses are okay, these ones are not. The other one is hard whitelisting, right? Setting up a repository and telling people they have to pull from it. The problem with that is you still need the rules to govern what's in that hard repository and literally how you maintain it. So in general, I would start with what do you want to define as approved before you start going with where am I storing it and how am I limiting access?
Correct. Okay.
So I'll dive in on this one just because this is the one I'm passionate about. Somebody asked earlier about remediation. I love it when questions, have a follow-up slide, a slide or two later. So, this is a survey we did. We actually went through and said, okay, great. Tell us what your problems are remediating vulnerabilities in applications. And we asked some ridiculous number of people. And this happened back in 2015 and in 2020. And the top 3 didn't change, right? The 3 biggest problems with remediating vulnerabilities are being able to actually perform the patches, being able to detect it in the first place, and not having tools that tell me how to handle this. And I think they're all the same problem, just phrased a little bit differently. I don't know what problems I have because I don't have the tools in place to actually detect them. And once they're detected, I don't have the tools in place to tell me what the heck to actually do to remediate the problems. Specifically in vulnerabilities, remediation takes the form of updates, pretty much almost all the time, of different kinds of updates. This is fundamentally an increasing problem. You can kind of even see that in the data of shifting upwards a little bit. And it's sort of hammered home a little bit by the lack of qualified personnel available. The biggest difference between 2015 and 2020, well, there's a lot of differences, especially 2020. But fundamentally, in AppSec, the biggest difference is we know more of the problems we have. We know how much farther we have to go. And that's upped the need for qualified personnel. And I think somebody touched on this in the Q&A as well, which is, who does this? Whose job is it to actually make sure everything is being governed correctly? And unfortunately, there's no good, clean answer on exactly, if for every organization, that's a little bit different of an answer because every organization is organized differently. But one thing that's very, very true is whoever is ultimately responsible can't do it manually and can't do it on their own. It has to be a group effort. It has to be tool-based, and it has to be automated.
Yeah, and automation specifically with those key tools, not just security tools, but observability tools, to be able to actually see at variant levels, how your processes are functioning, how the tools that you're leveraging are working together. Oftentimes organizations will, give this over to their architecture team per a previous question, and they're in charge of just managing that. Everything has to go through the board for approval, and we'll govern this and manage it. But the reality is, and we both mentioned this a little earlier, that's a completely different webinar series. But if you go to DevOps and start to think through really a DevSecOps type of model, as you automate these components, a lot of organizations who aren't fully automating tend to look at vulnerability scans as something they do either quarterly, maybe half a year, or once a year, and they don't really find out there are key vulnerabilities until those scans are completed. And that automation, again, is something that can be done and made integrated with your observability tools so that it's constantly available for everyone to see these potential problems and allows you to scale and manage this in a more efficient way.
So one caution on that, just to go back to an earlier question, is you have to get that down to a manageable level before you surface that all that observations, or all you're doing is flooding everybody with noise and scaring the hell out of everybody. you come at them and you implement it and say, hey, the first report's out. It's got 20,000 problems. That's an unsurmountable hill to climb. Everybody's like, well, this is useless. So, if you're implementing, you want to get it to a good, healthy-ish place before surfacing that I can't say it. I'm skipping that word.
Observability. Yeah.
Thank you.
But and I agree, but the reality really needs to be, who has access to your observability tools? When is the right time for the stakeholders to be able to view those once the appropriate KPI and metrics are defined to help people understand, and to your point, Jeff, not scare people to a point where we have an unusable tool. So,
Right.
it is a happy medium, but, some of that is managing, again, your best practices, your solution base, and creating a framework that'll meet that need. Okay, so, I think we talked a little bit about some of what the needs for governance are and kind of a sideways way, but really the benefits of adopting, one of the key things all organizations as a component of COVID and over the last year are really focused on improving their total cost of ownership. Maintaining and managing your code base, your infrastructure, understanding the various security and vulnerability risks, potential audit and licensing problems that you may have are things that organizations are very key to work on. And certainly adopting open source is one key way to reduce your total cost of ownership. But understanding that, I went to a conference a year ago, pre-COVID, so I guess it'd be 2 years at this point. And I talked to a lawyer from an organization who was starting to adopt open source, who had never worked with open source before. And the sheer complexity of the variant licenses was something that he and his team were working very hard to try and understand and manage. And that's one of those things that really helps organizations to move forward, is you have to have a key understanding. But the other benefits of the governance platform really help leadership, not only internally, but really start to build a better reputation for organizations as they come forward, have quicker time to market, have fewer risks and vulnerability issues pop up, and your customers certainly see some of these. The flexibility, but one of the other benefits, not so much of governance, but adopting open source in general, and as a result, implementing this key capabilities is bringing in key talent to organizations. One of the things Jeff mentioned are a lack of qualified people, or people who truly understand how to manage these vulnerabilities and your risks. Well, that continues to grow, and organizations who adopt open source and really dive into this really find a lot of talent that's looking in this new era to move that forward. But risks and mitigations, again, and Jeff mentioned security assessments and versioning, and I mentioned integration management. But a key component of all of this, and part of your governance, is really building out a support model. That, and a few questions asked this: who manages the governance? But really being able to manage, what is your approach to how you support, the use of open source, the licensing management, all your vulnerabilities within the organization, and what tools you will and won't use, is really something that you need to clearly define. And most organizations, their governance is clearly defined for the use of a few proprietary tools, but understanding the governance of open source is something that needs to be built out in greater detail. So,
yeah, I mean, it's one of these areas. I mean, this is sort of summing up a lot of what we've been talking about, right? But this is one of these areas that always requires a little bit of selling upwards, right? This is effort, therefore expense. But it's not usually that hard if it's presented correctly, as this is really a risk. Here's the steps we need to actually go through to mitigate this risk. And things like the support model, this makes a lot of sense to executives if there is a need to sell upwards. It's not that hard for them to understand the importance of keeping up to date on things. But very often the default is open source equals free, and they move on. So just because you're not, having to develop the code yourself doesn't mean you don't have to handle all the risks that come with it.
Yeah, and one question kind of asked this, how do we leverage the importance of open source? And at the same time, how can anyone scale success through open source? And I think the slide starts to talk about this at a high level. Again, improve total cost of ownership, the flexibility and scalability of tools using a community, not just your internal development staff, leveraging, best practices that exist within the industry to really help do that. Improved thought leadership within your organization, more investiture of your staff to really get involved and help build out tools, not only internally, but if you find an open source tool that really benefits you, start to become an expert in that will help drive your client base forward, as well as your ability to attract that talent I mentioned earlier. So those are some key benefits. Certainly supportability and being more secure are other aspects that an organization certainly wants, especially the security department within your organization. But those are key functional things that really show that value proposition of utilizing open source.
There are non-functional things as well. It is definitely a morale boost, I think, for most developers to be able to contribute back to something, especially if it's allowed as part of their job and sponsored a little. And it helps resume building and all that other stuff. I've never heard of a developer who is against this. This is usually something they're happy about. So the functional things are all very important, but there is also some morale and some opportunity creation there as well.
Absolutely. And it speaks to longevity of employees. If what you're offering is potentially come and help us maintain an application that we've been working on for 5-6 years, or hey, we're working on some cool innovative things, you'll have the ability to learn and contribute to these cool new projects, certainly makes a lot of developers move toward organizations that allow for that.
Absolutely.
Jeff?
Did I mute myself there? Sorry.
I think moving into this next slide.
Sorry, I think I lost connection there for a second. Can you guys hear me now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, great. Thanks. Okay, so next slide here. Sorry, everything's delayed for a second there. So, let's kind of move this off onto tooling a little bit, because enabling all of these is great. You need all the policies, you need the governance framework, frankly, before the tooling can be very effective. But you can't actually govern anything without a lot of automated tooling. And it needs to be pretty proactive. Reactive only is not going to get the job done. It'll create too much noise. It needs to be the right information at the right time. So that's starting as early as possible, shifting left, to use the industry buzzword, right? Kind of fully embracing DevSecOps means embedding a lot of this as early in the cycles as possible so that there's less to handle. For us, that means things like we've pursued, embedding into the IDEs so that before the code's even checked in, hey, you're about to use this library that's out of date. Very helpful information, doesn't have to go through a remediation cycle, hand it right to the developer when they're selecting the open source, and you've prevented some of those issues. So, to me, the big key things to look for in any tooling, obviously I'm biased on which one, but the key that's important is, to fully cover as much of your actual code as possible. And this is really important. If you have to stitch together multiple tools to be able to cover, one per language, God forbid, you're going to have a tough time. And it's very common to see some of this tooling work only for, just for Maven, just for NPM, or only for package managed code. It doesn't work for, loose C files. So being able to cover your full tech stack is very important, as much as possible with one tool. You absolutely need to make sure that, everything's up to date, of course, and accurate. That's sort of table stakes. But like I said, being able to present the information not just as part of the CI/CD pipeline, but earlier and later, shifting left and right, basically, left into the IDEs and the repos, right into post-deployment monitoring, right? It needs to tell you, hey, your inventory just had a new vulnerability pop up, or there's a new version available, you need to update. And then ultimately, you need to have the policy engines in place to actually be able to execute your governance plan. So things like we've talked about, right? These licenses are okay. These are not. These haven't been looked at yet. Or kind of more fundamentally, this particular vulnerability matters to you, or it's a high severity in a critical area of your application. And then finally, a good tooling system gives you intelligent remediation. And what I mean by intelligent there is it's not just, hey, update to the latest version. It's doing things like creating pull requests for you so that you can just merge it in. And it just requires a quick look. Be like, oh, okay, great. And some of the stuff we're excited about that's kind of coming in the future and slightly delivered already is things that give you non-security or legal governance risks, like quality, right? Has anybody touched this open source project in 2 years? And from what we can see, things like what we call merge confidence, how likely is this to cause functional issues? What percentage of people do we see that it fails the automated tests when they update this? Some interesting areas there. I'm purposely rushing through that slide a little bit to make sure we leave time for more questions, because I think questions are more interesting than listening to me talk. Maybe not Eric. Eric was pretty interesting, but the questions are more fun, at least for me.
Yeah. Questions are always fun. And we've gotten a lot of really great questions in so far. So I do want to let folks know there is we have about 5 or 7 minutes or so left for question and answer period. So if you have a question, go ahead and get it on in. We may not get to them all, but please know that the folks from White Source will be getting a copy of all the questions that came in. So I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline to get your question answered. Okay, Mehul asks one question here. It's kind of interesting about open source in the education sector. How can we introduce open source in the education sector so that every portion of society can take the benefits of open source, especially for rural students who are not enough privileged to take the benefit of studying in big universities? So that is a lot to unwrap there.
Yeah, I think I'll take a stab at this one to begin with. I think that one of the core benefits of open source in general is its availability. There isn't really the limitation of access other than internet access. And the reality is, if you have internet access, now it is a key consideration of which ones are more relevant than others for an educational perspective. Looking at industry trends, I mean, realistically, if you want to dive to just an application development perspective, tools like Python and Java and others are open source. We'll get into the conversation about Oracle versus open Java, but in this conversation component of what are the more prevalent ones in the industry really becomes an open conversation of if people in rural areas have access to the internet and computers, they can for free pull down any of these open source libraries and begin to work on them locally. There is, for more prevalent tools like, Python, for example, as a programming language versus other tools that you would use, Elastic, which is used for log management and other components, it has an open source version. The real component here is, what are you trying to teach these rural students? What is the scope of the programming you want them to do? Is it language based? Is it infrastructure based? In those cases, defining that is the first key step. But again, it's freely available. Unlike at a large university, they're going to focus very specifically on a given set of technologies. Where in the industry, more and more, I would argue that a lot of what you learn in college, especially colleges that still teach languages like COBOL and Pascal and things in engineering, and it's been a lot of years since I've been in college, so I'll be honest, I'm not 100% certain, but you have a broader scope of knowledge base from the internet than you do from a university.
I will say, in general, development, and especially the open source area, is not something that's exclusively the domain of big universities like some of the sciences, right? It is one of the more open areas of anything. There is nothing stopping anybody with an internet connection from learning how to develop and contributing directly to an open source. People welcome them. It's a very low barrier. I think the biggest thing is just making sure people are aware of it. And also, I'll just share personally, I know a great many people come from rural areas who got their start and built a good resume by just contributing to open source. It's free work, but it's very, very good experience.
All right.
Working with a team, distributed, it's great.
Awesome. All right, great. Next question here comes from Peter. He asked, does WhiteSource also find third-party license in source code like .js files, icons, graphics, or code snippets developers took from drag and drop?
Not code snippets. And if your developers are doing that, make them stop. It's very scary. That's not something we do. I'll be honest, it's an old way of handling things. It's also incredibly resource intensive and doesn't really match with the modern DevSecOps chains because the scanning takes too long. And we do support third-party licenses. We are open source only, though, and I'm not aware of any like icons or graphics that are open source licensed like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, most of them are copyrighted, and the copyright is a little different than licenses for technology. So.
Excellent. Okay, I think we have time for one more question here. Kenneth asks, curious regarding the remediation, what steps to go through? I really want to avoid sending out a massive report with 10,000 possible vulnerabilities. Our idea is 1, clean up inventory, 2, update reference framework, 3, embed in CI/CD. Sounds simple enough.
Sounds like not a bad approach.
Yeah.
We touched on it a few times, right? Don't just implement it in CI/CD and have it create Jira tickets. You'll drive your developers insane. Make sure things are cleaned up as much. Usually, a good place to start is some sort of update drive. Just figure out what you have and notice all the stuff that's out of date, and just be like, okay, guys, let's try to update everything, and then implement all of these pieces. But that can be done in parallel with developing your governance policies. And should be.
Yeah, and arguably is a core tenet of your governance platform. But embedding that in CI/CD pipelines is certainly, that automation is a key component to do that.
Okay. All right. I think we can sneak in one more, and then we'll definitely cut it off. So another question from Mehul. Sometimes third-party intrusion can cause failure of the whole open source system. So how can we eliminate this problem?
Whew, that's a big topic.
Well, go big or go home.
First off, anytime I hear anybody talk about eliminating risk, no, all you can do is reduce it.
Right.
And you can reduce the impact it can have. There are definitely ways to make sure that this third-party intrusion, depending on what you mean, there's a couple of different vectors that could be. But I'll take the one that was in the news recently. It really does boil down to knowing what you have and where it's from. And that's the fundamentals of all risk, frankly, outside of software too. Just period.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, the reality of this is that even with proprietary tooling, depending on the version you're using, if you're not getting regular security updates, someone in the industry or not so much the industry, but someone out there is constantly looking for ways to poke holes in technology. And if those aren't currently happening, I mean, I would argue that, in a lot of cases, security patches will happen in very established community projects much quicker than in some large proprietary tools. But, it's not just an open source problem. The reality, to Jeff's point, is you really need to understand where that's happening and how they manage those compliance changes and how frequently it's being updated. So
I will say, just from a governance perspective, the other piece that's relevant here is don't automatically update to latest versions. And, somebody puts out a .01 release and it leaves you open, right? You got to be a little more careful than that.
Right. All right. I'll stop doing that. No, I'm kidding. Okay. All right.
Charlie, you always crack me up.
We're about 2 minutes to the top of the hour. So unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for the question and answer period. But I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. And if we didn't get to it, I apologize. But again, please know that the folks at WhiteSource are getting a copy of all the questions that came in. And they will, I guarantee you, they will follow up with you offline to get your question answered.
Yeah, one quick
Sure.
note. If you want to make note of this last slide and you'd like to reach out to Jeff or I, you can certainly send us an email or contact us on one of these networks, and we'll be happy to also address some of these questions in a broader, or if you have projects that you're looking for help on. Shameless plug.
Awesome. There you go.
Hey,
all right.
right now we get to give away some Amazon gift cards, right, Charlene?
We do, after a quick reminder that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. We will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website. So you can find it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Okay, we have actually already done the drawing on the back end for our 4 Amazon gift cards. So Jake R, Peter M, John W, and Melanie G, congratulations to all 4 of you. We will be reaching out to you via email to get your gift card over to you, so please check your inbox. Jeffrey and Eric, thank you both for a great webinar. Good stuff all the way around. Really, really appreciate your expertise and your time as always.
Always fun.
Thank you.
And Eric, thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you,
all right.
Jeff.
Bye, guys.
And I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.